We finished the first section by raising the question of what is inherited and how that leads to risk for schizophrenia. Well, we know a little bit about that. One is that the neurotransmitter dopamine is clearly involved in schizophrenia. The evidence suggests that there is either an excess of dopamine, that is too much dopamine in the synapse, or an excessive sensitivity, that is too many dopamine receptors. Now, normally dopamine is what we call an activation function. It tends to increase the activity level of many other neurotransmitters. It is involved in certain centers of the brain. So, for example, the pleasure centers of the brain and the motor centers both use dopamine extensively. So the anhedonic symptoms that are found in schizophrenia and the Parkinson's-like symptoms that are a result of the medications used for treating schizophrenia make sense because of the role of dopamine. Now, there's actually a large body of research consistent with this. I'm not going to go through all of it. I did mention earlier that a condition, amphetamine psychosis, is indistinguishable from schizophrenia. And taking amphetamines, if you have schizophrenia, will make your psychotic symptoms worse. Phenothiazines, the primary treatment at one time for schizophrenia, improves symptoms and seems to do it by decreasing the activity of dopamine. And estrogen, the female hormone, reduces the sensitivity of dopamine. Now, the rate of schizophrenia in men and women is the same, but on average, males develop schizophrenia about 5 years earlier than females do. So the estrogen in females may reduce the sensitivity of dopamine and therefore reduce the risk for schizophrenia, but not enough to change the risk, but only to delay it for a few years. By the way, estrogen tends to have this positive effect for a lot of conditions, not just schizophrenia. For example, one of the reasons why heart disease tends to be more common in men than women is that estrogen seems to protect women from heart disease. After menopause, the rate of heart disease is the same in men and women. Now, in the previous slide, I mentioned that there might be an excess of dopamine or excessive sensitivity. Remember, the way a cell works is when the cell fires at the axon terminal, neurotransmitters are released. In our figure here, the neurotransmitters are those funny little box things with a V. So if you imagine that to be dopamine molecules, they fit into the similar shaped holes in the dendrite of the next cell, and they'll bind to it, stimulating the next cell. Excess dopamine means that more dopamine is released, so there's more dopamine in the synapse. Excess sensitivity means that you have the same amount of dopamine, but you have a lot more dopamine receptors. More dopamine or more receptors increases the probability that dopamine as a neurotransmitter will stimulate the next cell. This is a complicated slide, but I only want you to focus on one take-home message, actually two. First of all, everything in purple there are parts of the brain that have been implicated with research evidence in schizophrenia. They're parts of the brain that don't function properly in schizophrenia compared to people who don't have schizophrenia. Most of them are midbrain structures where emotion is controlled. None of them are in the cerebral cortex where we do most of our thinking and perception, yet the symptoms of schizophrenia are thought disorder and perceptual distortions. The take-home message here is very simple. Lower parts of the brain seem to influence higher functioning and put people at risk for schizophrenia. And two, it's not one part of the brain that's dysfunctional, but rather several different parts, suggesting that whatever is going on biologically in schizophrenia is affecting lots of the brain and therefore probably accounting for the wide variety of symptoms that we see in schizophrenia. One of the things that we noticed early on when techniques were developed to take pictures of the brain is that there was evidence of cerebral atrophy in many individuals who had schizophrenia. Now remember, the term originally used for schizophrenia by Kraepelin was dementia praecox, and we have cerebral atrophy that is a part of all other dementias. But it wasn't found in all patients with schizophrenia. Now, in time, we recognize that the more chronic the condition, that is, the longer that the patient was diagnosed with schizophrenia, the more likely that you saw cerebral atrophy. Young patients who had only been diagnosed for a few years typically didn't see massive evidence of cerebral atrophy. But there was a particularly interesting group, and that is identical twins who were discordant for schizophrenia. They shared 100% of their genes, but one developed schizophrenia and one did not. Now, identical twins look alike, and their brains look alike. Now, you might say, well, brains of everyone look alike. No, they don't. Brains are no more alike than faces are. Now, faces are pretty much alike. You know, we all have two eyes and a nose and a mouth, and they're all in roughly the same position. And yet, we can tell the difference, with the exception of identical twins, of people quite easily because of subtle differences in where their eyes are and their hairline and all these other small features. Well, the same is true of the brain, except in identical twins. Identical twins have identical faces. They have identical fingerprints, and their brain is identical. But when they are discordant for schizophrenia, one has a disorder and one does not. The one with the disorder shows cerebral atrophy compared to the one who does not have the disorder. It appears that Kraepelin was correct, that part of schizophrenia involves a slow process of cerebral atrophy that is going on throughout the lifetime and accumulates over time. But it produces dramatic symptoms early in life that, by the way, tend to become less dramatic and more negative symptoms as opposed to positive or disorganized symptoms over time. This is my favorite slide. It's the most interesting story. At the end of the first part of this chapter, I raised the question of what is it that is inherited, because we get our genes at conception, but we tend not to see schizophrenia develop for 20 or 30 years later. Well, in a very clever study, Elaine Walker, who's now at Emory University, and her colleagues looked at younger children who later went on to develop schizophrenia. Now, normally you would do that with a retrospective study. That is, you would find the people with schizophrenia and you take a look at what they were like when they were children. But retrospective studies tend not to have accurate information. But she got past that by taking recordings that were very precise, that happened to already exist. In this case, they were home movies and photographs that were taken by the parents as the children were growing up. She used as control siblings who never developed schizophrenia. And then she had those evaluated by people who had no idea which of the children went on to develop schizophrenia. And what she found was consistent evidence of very subtle neurological signs. Usually it would be unusual facial expressions or movements that indicated some clumsiness that's often associated with what are called soft neurological signs or minor neurological problems. So these children at age 5, at age 10, at age 12 and 15, they weren't showing psychotic symptoms. They weren't even showing anything close to psychotic symptoms. But there was evidence that something neurological was happening. And it was so subtle that no one could see it except with the comparison in great detail from these photographic records. Now, we've spent a great deal of time trying to understand more about the neurobiology, and talking about all of that would literally take days or weeks. Mostly what we're looking for is evidence, biological evidence, that is predictive of risk for schizophrenia. We call those endophenotypes. Okay, they're phenotypes in the sense that they're related to genetic characteristics. But they're not the phenotypes of schizophrenia. They're the phenotypes of behaviors that we can measure that seem to indicate that the risk factor is there. Individuals who go on to develop schizophrenia tend to have a slower reaction time and attentional problems that are apparent well before the development of the disorder. They also have problems with their working memory, which affects some types of cognitive tasks, but not others. They also have difficulty in moving their eyes smoothly following a pendulum. Pendulums move in a very predictable motion, and most of us have no difficulty keeping our eyes focused directly on the pendulum. But where our eyes move smoothly with the pendulum, people at risk for schizophrenia tend to have a jerky movement. All of these have been demonstrated to indicate some increased risk for schizophrenia. They're also found in a lot of individuals in families where there are people who have schizophrenia, and they're found even in people who never develop schizophrenia. Can a virus increase the risk for schizophrenia? Actually, it can. It's an interesting story how we discovered this. When computers were first available, we literally at that time had millions of individuals with schizophrenia where we had some data. And with a computer, we were finally able to look at that data in a sophisticated way. And one of the first things we noticed is that instead of having an equal probability of schizophrenia for every day of the year, the rates of schizophrenia were slightly higher in people that were born in May, June, and July. Now, it took a while to figure out what was going on. It turns out that the flu season for people born in May, June, and July tends to be most active during the second trimester of the time they are in the womb. And so if your mother gets the flu during the second trimester of when you're in the womb, you are at a slightly elevated risk for schizophrenia. Now, why the second trimester? It turns out that during the second trimester, that's when your brain is wiring itself at the most rapid rate. So your brain is essentially getting the basic circuits wired during that period. And therefore, the flu, which is a stressor to the developing embryo, may disrupt the process of wiring the brain. Now, this is not a cause. We talk about this as a two-hit model. Being at risk for schizophrenia, which involves having genes that put you at risk, is one of the hits. Your mother having the flu during the second trimester of your gestation period is a second hit, which increases the risk further. There are other hits that are known. Anoxia during the birth, usually caused by the cord wrapping around your neck and blocking for a brief time the blood supply to the brain, is another hit that increases the risk for schizophrenia. Now, neither the virus or the anoxia cause schizophrenia. They just increase the risk in those people already at risk. Now, there's a second issue with viruses. This is very speculative, so don't take it seriously, but it's an interesting idea. Remember that there were no clear examples of descriptions of schizophrenia going back more than 300 years. And yet we know that genes play a huge role in schizophrenia. Those genes had to go back more than 300 years. So why didn't they cause schizophrenia before? Well, genes always interact with the environment. So it's possible that the environment changed 300 years ago that made genes that didn't do much of anything suddenly risk factors for a serious disorder like schizophrenia. The person who discovered the fact that there are no descriptions of schizophrenia going back more than 300 years, Irv Gottesman, suggested that what might have happened is a slow virus. Slow viruses tend to affect large numbers of people, but they're very hard to detect. But they may change. In fact, we know that many slow viruses change the way genes function. Now, that's speculation. I'm not even sure it's a testable hypothesis. It certainly would be very hard to test with the technology that we currently have. But it may very well be that some environmental factor made genes that were pretty benign problematic. And that accounts for the fact that schizophrenia doesn't seem to be common 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. The woman shown in this slide is Frieda Fromm-Reichmann. She was one of the few people ever to be successful using psychotherapy with people who had schizophrenia. And she was an amazing therapist. She also worked almost exclusively with individuals who had schizophrenia. And she proposed what now is almost an infamous hypothesis called the schizophrengenic mother. Schizophrengenic simply means that the mother led to, she was the genesis of, the psychotic symptoms found in the children. Basically, it was the mother's fault. Now, we don't take that seriously, although you will see plenty of examples on the internet, because a lot of ideas that have been discredited, the people writing about them on the internet have no idea they've been discredited. There is no evidence that mothers increase, or fathers for that matter, the risk for schizophrenia other than the fact that these clearly pass on genes, and some of those genes might be increasing the risk for the child. What's important here is that she had legitimate data. She noticed that many of the mothers, and by the way, she saw very few of the fathers, because she practiced in the Midwest at a very exclusive clinic, and very wealthy people who had a child who developed schizophrenia might send their children 1,000 or 1,500 miles to this clinic where they would live for a year or 2 or 3 for the special treatment. At the time, typically it was only one parent who was working, usually the father, and to be wealthy, they were very busy with their work. So the only parent who would come out and visit would be the mother. And Fromm-Reichmann noticed that the mothers sometimes were rather odd. They were not psychotic, but they were a little odd. Now we understand that now because we know that schizotypal personality disorder is genetically related to schizophrenia. They share the same genes. People with schizophrenia have psychotic symptoms. People with schizotypal personality disorder tend to be a little odd. Fromm-Reichmann thought that the oddness in the mother caused the psychotic symptoms in the child. And it never occurred to her that it might be shared genes. Now, part of the reason for that is at the time, almost everyone in psychology and psychiatry believed that all psychological disorders were caused by the environment and that genes played no role. So the zeitgeist at the time had them oblivious to the possibility that genes might be a contributing factor.